So, a key question 4. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. And of course, this is the funny one, where it's just lots of different attempts by people to run the country, all of which come crashing down until Charles II returns in 1660. So this is sort of 1649 to 1660, that time period from the moment they kill the king to when Charles II arrives. And of course, it's called the Interregnum. And why the Interregnum?
That means between kings.
It means between kings. It's Latin for in between kings. So this is the first one. Of course, this is the first little attempt of the rump. So this is kind of 1649 to 1653 is this kind of sort of period of time. Right, there are sort of a dozen or so pictures. Remember, this tells the story of the rump bit of it. This is, of course, those 60 MPs. Starts off, they kill the king. 60 MPs are running the country. Well, what do they do? Can you remember the pictures? Rump, yeah, okay, so I call this bit sort of the rump, and that's why you've got that there. So the Rump Parliament take over the country. What do they do? So they abolish the monarchy. What do you call a country without a monarchy? So England becomes a republic. They also abolish the Lords, yeah, the House of Lords. That was my dodgy one with the guy playing cricket. So they abolished the House of Lords, and then...
Make a U-turn.
Who does?
The people who were for the law?
Yeah, so a few MPs come back. A few of the 250 or so, some of the people who were kept out by the army, some of them choose to return and come back to the rump and start picking up the pieces of the country. Next one. Heselridge. So yeah, really kind of one of the leading members of the Rump Parliament, people like Denzil Hollis and Arthur Heselridge, or Heselridge, however you pronounce it. So these are the people leading it. Next one. The engagement. Yes, this is such a key thing for the first half of the interregnum. And the engagement was this: Parliament published this document, and they said, right, if you want to hold any position in government, any government office at all, you had to swear the engagement. And what the engagement was, it said, we approve of the working of the rump. It was and the problem is, to approve of the working of the rump means to say, we approve that they killed the king. So the engagement was essentially a statement of people to serve in any office in government. You had to say, I approve of the king's death. And that meant that many MPs didn't approve of the king's death, therefore, many people across the country weren't prepared to approve of the king's death, therefore they refused to swear the engagement, therefore they refused to work with the Rump Parliament. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it meant that the rump, right from the word go, cuts its support. Okay, it does mean that everybody who's working as part of the government, or any office of government, is really committed, but reality is it's got far fewer people to call on than it should have done. This was a big error. Next. Okay, so what they do, the rump brings about, or it doesn't really bring about religious toleration. And that's the key thing. So it kind of clamps down on the religious independence. So who's not going to be happy with that? Where's the army's still there. It kind of clamps down on these religious independence, not really allowing them any freedom. So it's isolating the junior officers in the army. Again, this one.
Is it Cromwell dominates Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cromwell goes over to Ireland and actually submisses he defeats the Irish Rebellion, completely end of. So he goes there, and this is supposed to show a town called Drogheda. And particularly, it's a nasty place in Ireland. So, Drogheda. And in Drogheda in Ireland, it was a classic example of Cromwell going over there and actually giving no quarter, killing men, women, children. But essentially, Cromwell takes over the New Model Army into Ireland and ends the Irish Rebellion, and frankly starts centuries worth of Irish conflict. Next one. Dunbar. The Scots, as soon as Charles I is killed, the Scots come out in support of Charles II. They declare Charles II is king, and consequently attack England. And at the Battle of Dunbar, the Scots again fight the New Model Army, and once again the Scots are defeated. So the New Model Army defeat the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar. 1651 is the Battle of Worcester. Charles II himself comes over to the country to try and recapture the throne and defeat the New Model Army. Again, fails. That's the Third Civil War. It's the Battle of Worcester, 1651.
Oh, is that when they changed the laws back to the norm?
Yeah, absolutely. Rump starts some reasonable reforms. For example, they abolish Norman French. So still, up until this point, the official language of England, the official legal language of England was Norman French. And they said, well, that's stupid. I mean, it meant that to be a lawyer, you had to know Norman French. And so they changed it to English. Very sensible reform.
It fell between two stools.
Right, that's the problem. It wasn't radical enough for the radicals, it wasn't moderate enough for the moderates. It fell between two stools. The engagement kept out most moderates. The fact that they had no religious toleration and no political toleration meant it wasn't radical enough for the religious or the political radicals. It fell between two stools. It wasn't popular enough, and therefore it was shut down. Cromwell himself went in there with Colonel Harrison and the Fifth Monarchists, and they shut down the Rump. He goes in there and says, I say you are no parliament. Take away these baubles, and the Rump is kicked out. It's not dissolved because, of course, the Rump would have to approve of its own dissolution. It's just physically kicked out. And so, who's coming next? The Barebones Parliament. So that's the Rump. So it's about a very short period of time, 49 to about 53. Any questions about that? Okay, boom. So Barebones Parliament is what, of course, comes next. Again, a bunch of pictures, what we got about the Barebones Parliament. So this is a kind of a, what do we know?
They don't want a dictatorship.
Right, they don't want an army dictatorship. That's what they want. So Oliver Cromwell and Colonel Harrison and his Fifth Monarchists have kicked out the Rump Parliament, but they don't want a military dictatorship. They do not want the army to run the country. They want democratic government. But can they allow a democratic government, a freely elected government? No, why not?
Because they radicals.
What?
Well, radicals might be put in.
Radicals might be put in, actually. They probably quite like that.
Is it because not everyone votes, so certain people would go?
Yep. The biggest fact is that people just don't like the army. The army is not popular with anybody except for the army themselves. They're seen as too much of a threat in the country. And so they don't want a military dictatorship. They want people to choose. They don't want the army to run the country. They want MPs. But people don't like the army, and therefore they can't allow. The army were not willing to have a freely elected government, because if they did, it would mean that the government might well, in fact probably would, be anti-army. You with me? Strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. The army wants its own position. So what do? What did the army do? How did they set up the Barebones?
Yeah.
8? What's what? 8 gnomes? Put those 2 words around the other way. Nominate. Yes, the army nominated. The army nominated the people that they wanted to be in the Barebones Parliament. And so they set it up. And so they chose, and specifically the people they tended to choose were often religious radicals. Now, actually, the religious radicals weren't the majority. They were all religious men. It was also known as the Parliament of Saints, because they believed that they could create a kind of godly society if they put these sort of various religious men in. But it's called the Barebones Parliament. Why?
Because the Barebones, the name of the guy.
Yeah, one of the leading guys was, praise God, Nicholas Barbon, and therefore his nickname was Barebones, and that's what's known as the Barebones Parliament. Also, sorry? Indiana, no, it's not. Harrison Ford. Thomas Harrison was one of the other people involved. He was one of the people involved in getting rid of the Rump. He was a Fifth Monarchist, and the Fifth Monarchists did very much tend to dominate what was going on. Why? Because they were organised. They were organised, and therefore they were able to manipulate what Parliament was doing because they were organised, whereas the more moderate religious people within the Barebones Parliament were disorganised. What do?
Am I thinking of the Tudors when I say something about civil marriage?
You're not thinking about the Tudors. You're thinking, right? Yes, they for the first time they brought civil marriage. They like the Rump. The Rump brought in some reasonable reforms with law reforms. Actually, this brought in some reasonable reforms as well. They introduced civil marriage for the first time. Civil marriage not in your parish church. And I think that was a kind of a gesture towards the religious radicals who might want to get married not in their parish church but in some other place of worship. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they brought in civil marriage. They also
Improved conditions for humans.
yeah, they did. They improved conditions and lunatic asylums. I'm not sure that's too PC these days to say, but there we go. That's how it's phrased. In the lunatic asylums, they improved conditions for people. They also
Gave people.
kind of, yes, they improved conditions for debt collection, but also they abolished tithes. Can you remember what a tithe is?
The church.
It was the 10% church tax. People were supposed to pay 10% of their tax to their local church to run the church. They abolished it. Fifth monarchists did not approve of tithes, and they abolished tithes. But the problem is they didn't put any alternative funding in place. And so they started stripping out all these kind of things, but they didn't put anything back in its place. Lastly, well, not lastly, the radicals. So the radicals dominated, say, this minority, mostly fifth monarchists, and what they would do, in the mornings before Parliament, they go to a house just across from the House of Commons called Mr. Squibb's house, and they'd have a prayer meeting. And during the prayer meeting, they'd decide what they would want to take action on during the course of the day, and they'd have a very early morning prayer meeting. Then they'd go to the House of Parliament, haven't decided what they were going to do, pass some laws, pass some motions, before the moderates had got anywhere near the building. So by the time the moderates turned up during the day, the various things, the tithes had been abolished, and the various reforms had taken place. Last picture. Prayer meeting. Yeah, this is what happened to the... Can you remember what happened to the Barebones Parliament?
So the moderates went in while they were still in the Prime Minister.
So the moderates played them at their own game. They realised the moderates didn't want to be part of the Barebones Parliament. In fact, some of them had already dropped out. And so what they did is, whilst the radicals were at Mr. Squibb's house praying in the morning, the moderates got themselves organised, they got into the Houses of Parliament, they got themselves in the House of Commons, and they dissolved the Barebones Parliament whilst the radicals were at their prayer meeting. And then the radicals all turned up there to find Parliament dissolved, and there's this great line where the Speaker of the House of Commons goes there and sees these radicals praying about what to do. And he says, "What are you doing?" And these radicals said, "We are seeking the Lord." And the Speaker of the House of Commons said to them, "Well, then he may go elsewhere, gentlemen, because for my knowledge he has not been here these past 12 years. I quite like that little line. Anyway, so the Barebones Parliament is indeed failed. So Rump fails, Barebones fails to keep control. What's next? Right, we're now at the back end of 1653. It's the instrument of government, and therefore it's the turn of who? Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell. So now we can actually go over there. So Oliver Cromwell's turn to run the country, and this, of course, is known as the Protectorate. So here we go. What happened? The Barebones Parliament fell in 1653. People thought England was without a government. It looked like a chaos. Was England really without a government? No. So they knew full well what was going on here. There we go. That's the fall of Barebones. Great. Actually, what had happened is that the moderates had already been planning for this. It was a calculated move to get rid of Barebones. It was too radical for the most part, and so they had a written constitution in the waiting. Do you know what a written constitution is? Yeah, a written agreement, a written law setting out how the country was going to be run. In this case, it said there would be a civilian constitutional government. Civilian being, yeah, not military. Constitutional sticks to the laws. Having a constitution means you've got to stick to the laws. You're not a dictator. And it was going to bring some reforms before the Civil War. It was going to have a permanent standing army. And it was drawn up by this guy called Major General Lambert. He was a member of the Barebones Parliament, but quickly left when it was obviously Lambert. when it realised it was just radical and it was stupid. And so he went away and drew up the constitution. What did he call his constitution? The instrument of government. There we go. Parliament, moderates and Cromwell all probably knew of its existence, and which is why they were keen to or happy to get rid of the Barebones Parliament. Cromwell denied knowing of its existence, of course. So, dismissing the Barebones was probably a strategic idea. Barebones was kicked out on the 12th of December 53. Cromwell accepted the instrument of government on the 16th of December 53 and became Lord Protector of England. Okay. What does he do? So, the instrument of government. What did it say? It said the Lord Protector is head of state. The Lord Protector is in charge of army, but with Parliament's consent. There was a council named Parliament which choose the councillors. Harking back to the 10 propositions and the 19 propositions, all these things, Parliament would choose Cromwell's councillors. Any man with goods over £200 could vote. This is now fully in excess of 40 shillings. Money was provided to keep an army and a navy, and there would be religious toleration for everyone, except Anglicans and Catholics. And they would give £200,000 to pay for the government.
The £200 vote thing, is that a good thing or a bad?
That's actually, well,
What was 40 shillings? That's less, sorry.
yeah, it is less. So it seems to have gone up a bit.
So they made it more difficult for people to vote.
Would seem so. Although, having said that,
Wait, would the 40 shilling freeholder just be land? Would that be goods as well?
yeah, well, this suppose, the 40 shilling freeholders was just land, good spot. £200 is lands or goods, so brings in merchants. And I would say actually it's probably about the same, because of course you've now got inflation. So I would have thought during the course of the Civil War, I would say it's probably about the same. Although I don't know, because I don't know the inflation rate at that time. But I would say it would seem a bit weird to reduce the number of people voting. I think just broaden it out to not just land. Okay. It was a settled moderate constitution. It had some reasonable reforms. You know, the leader was really under the ultimate command of Parliament, so it should have been a reasonable thing. But the problem is that the army is still behind this all. The army is still there. There you go, they're behind the instrument of government. The army is behind it all. You have whoever is going to be Lord Protector would only work if they had the support of the army. If you don't have the support of the army, you are not going to work. And you also need the support not only of the army, but also the civilian population. So you need the support of the army and the population. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. To run the country, you needed both the army and the civilian population. There we go. It would only work. Cromwell did. Right, we'll ignore that. So, England under the Protectorate. Some people, surprisingly, oppose the instrument of government. Who? The people of Rump. Do you know, we call them a different name now. We call them now, well, what? Commonwealth's men. Well done. Some people who just saw it as Cromwell as a regicide. What's a regicide?
Killer.
Yeah, so a lot of people across the country saw, whichever were, the Rump, the Barebones, they saw them as king killers, regicides. Sorry?
Were they the people who agreed with King's death?
Yes. Well, no, because a lot of people didn't. So, of course, some people would not work with it. So, to run the country, you still need control in the localities. And it's the people, the gentry, who perhaps didn't know these things. You got? Oh, paper. The Commonwealth's men, these ex-Rump, Heselrigge, Scott, Hollis, they hated Cromwell for getting rid of the Rump in the first place. They themselves want to get back in power. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. There's lots of people trying to grab power. The religious radicals, they see Cromwell as the old dragon. He hasn't brought in enough religious independence. And the political radicals who don't see enough reforms, a betrayal of the good old cause, they haven't yet given the vote to anybody, all men. So there are quite a few ranging groups who are against it, but for the most part, the army is behind it and the civilian population are behind it. You with me? So some groups, but otherwise all good. Cromwell immediately starts bringing out some new law reforms. Can you remember some of the things that he does, his sensible law reforms?
Wasn't the whole thing with teachers?
There was something to do with teachers.
Oh, about the like first Ofsted
Finding
thing.
It's kind of like the first Ofsted, yes. First of all, he gets rid of the engagement. The engagement was still in existence. This document, this thing, this oath that people had to swear to say we support the government. And that meant that people could work with Cromwell and still believe that it was wrong to have killed the king. So creating a broader support. Does that make sense? So banning the engagement was a very sensible move. People could support Cromwell but still believe it was wrong to have killed the king. They brought in some law reforms regulating legal fees.
What was that?
What's the Hale thing with the church?
Uh,
Was it?
Yeah, the Hale Commission, that comes in a little bit later. He set up a triers to set improvement of religious ministers, and a county committee of electors to fire bad school teachers. You're fired. Many objected to these reforms. So, Cromwell's ordinances are indeed very sensible. So, oh, hello, I've just killed my computer. So, what's going to happen? Some sensible reforms. What about his church? Was it good? What do we know about it so far? Yeah, indeed. Well, under the instrument of government, what did they allow?
Religious tolerance.
Religious toleration. It was the most tolerant in Europe at this point. Each church could set their own boundaries. It was really kind of almost religious independence, almost. Toleration for all, even for Anglicans and Catholics. Jews were readmitted for the first time since Richard III had kicked them out. So there were even some attempts for religious cooperation, bringing together different denominations of the church to try and get them to work together, but that didn't really get very far. Some gentry persecuted the real extremes, the proper Puritans and Quakers, or the Rantons rather, but even Cromwell didn't want them persecuted. We looked at the Ranters, the free love sex, etc. lot. So, first Protectorate Parliament. So it starts off quite well. It's got religious reforms, religious toleration. Most people in the country are supporting it. It brings about some sensible reforms about regulating school teachers and ministers, but then calls his first Parliament. How does that go down?
Don't they try and undo his ideas?
They try and undo his ideas. September 1654, so this is 9 months into the Protectorate, and largely it's freely elected. What does that mean? If it's freely elected? Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be people who Cromwell has not chosen. It's going to be across broad spectrum of society, which means it was full of the Commonwealth's men. So it immediately overturned his reforms. They said he couldn't do it. What did he do? Cromwell's furious and made all MPs sign a recognition that they accepted the instrument. Cromwell suddenly has gained a bit of the divine right of kings about him and does not allow people to oppose his ideas. Ho, ho, ho. The opposing Commonwealth men refused and they left. But Parliament still refused to pay for an army over 30,000, then it was currently 50,000. Cromwell has still got to get rid of 20,000 men in the army. Is he going to do that? No. Why not?
Because if he dismisses them, they won't.
Exactly. Cromwell knows he can't, if he touches the army, he needs them for support. If he tries to fire 20,000, the army he might lose their support, and therefore, no longer protect it. Cromwell couldn't risk offending the army. 5 months later, he dissolves his first Parliament. They've removed his reforms, he's challenged them, they've come at loggerheads, they've argued with him, he gets rid of it. And then you suddenly get this thing called Penruddock's Rising. What's this? The government is nervous of a royalist conspiracy. And within the first year or so, Cromwell has a spy network, a guy called John Thurlow is running it, and all over the country they were keeping an eye on anybody who they feared was a royalist leader. Eventually, when there was a rebellion, they would jump on it and act on it. There was one rebellion, a royalist rebellion against the Protectorate, and that was Penruddock's rising. Who's Penruddock? John Penruddock, minor gentry, and Major General Desborough. This guy was easily able to put it down.
Had they already brought in those major generals?
Not yet, because of course that's the next point. So, so if you look at the bigger picture then, so Cromwell takes on the Protectorate, he brings about some sensible reforms, he calls his first Parliament, his Parliament removes his reforms and gets Cromwell irate, and then there's this minor royalist uprising. Cromwell is worried that the country he hasn't got proper control over the country. So what does he do? Because he wants to increase his control across the country. The Major General's experiment. So the government is now really worried about royalists and tries a Major General experiment. What can you remember about the Major General's experiment, 55 to 56?
People hated it.
They were hated, yeah? Who are they? What is the Major General's experiment?
The gentry bought them.
It wasn't gentry. In fact, it cut out the gentry.
Commanders in the army.
Commanders, the army, the Major Generals. How many?
11.
11, well done. 11, England was divided into 11 districts under a Major General. And these Major Generals were given a chance to set up a militia, enforce the poor laws, keep royalists under supervision, guard public morality, they closed brothels and gambling dens, collect 10% decimation tax of any royalists, make sure the justices of the peace did their job, that they were running the country effectively. And some were Puritan killjoys, they stopped any fun, my words. I.e. they went a bit too far and they closed down alehouses, not just the brothels. But these guys, they were army commanders who were running the country, almost like a mini dictator in lots of the different areas. In fact, that is what they were seen as. Some of them were really corrupt. This guy Worsley in Lancashire was indeed Puritan. He closed down the alehouses for fun. Butler in Northamptonshire was really corrupt. He blackmailed royalists, got enough money, built himself this nice little house, Cobthorne in Oundle. Some were decent and hard-working, but all the Major Generals got the reputation of being corrupt, Puritan, killjoy people. They were hated. They were seen as mini dictators. See what I did there? Yeah. And the gentry felt alienated from politics. Why? Because it's the gentry who are supposed to be running the country in the localities, and they don't do that anymore with the Major Generals. But where are the gentry? In Parliament. That Parliament is always the seat of the gentry. They resented the loss of power. Right, so Cromwell calls his second Protectorate Parliament. Was the first Protectorate Parliament a success? No, they tried to oppose him because it was freely elected. He calls a second Protectorate Parliament, and what happens? Immediately they want rid of the Major Generals, and Cromwell does so. The army hadn't realised the level of hatred. Cromwell removes the Major Generals. 58. Yeah, that's it. So Cromwell wants to keep his conservative situation and wants to keep his religious toleration, so he gets rid of the Major Generals. The moderates, the Conservatives in Parliament are so grateful that they offer Cromwell the crown in this document called the Humble Petition and Advice. They are so grateful that he's got rid of the Major Generals, that he's put the gentry really back in charge of the country again. Does Cromwell accept it? No, he doesn't. No. But really, apparently he thought long and hard about it. Why does he not accept it?
Because he probably lose quite a lot of the support of the people.
Yes.
He was the one that killed the king originally.
Interesting, yes, absolutely. I mean, he probably wouldn't lose support of the people, but he might lose support of army. The army, I think, is likely who it's going to be. Lose support. Here we go. In fact, Cromwell had always liked the monarchy with restrictions. He knew royalists would probably support him if he went for it. he knew the army would not, and he needed them for his power. Anyway, after he'd overseen the king's death, he thought, oh, it's hypocrisy, so I can't really do it. And eventually he said, I would not rebuild Jericho. Jericho was this biblical city of corrupt nature, and it was destroyed in the Bible, and therefore he said, no, I'm not going to rebuild up this evil city. So, they redrew this humble petition and advice. It was redrawn by the moderates, and all they did was take out the title King and replaced it with Lord Protector. And instead of the crown automatically passing to his oldest son, or nearest male heir, it would go to whoever Cromwell said it should go to. But otherwise, no different. He would essentially become King of England. He could pick his successor. See what I did there? Pick. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, the army were not pleased, but only 5 captains resigned. But, the army was still just about supporting Cromwell through. Lambert, Major General Lambert, the guy who drew up the instrument of government in the first place, was really cross. He was forced to resign, given a large pension. Doesn't mean he goes away anywhere, but yeah, he goes. Why was Lambert so cross, do you think?
He wanted to be next.
Because he wanted to be the next Lord Protector. But now Cromwell could pick his next one. He knows that Cromwell is likely to pick somebody in his family. So Lambert now is against what he's created. Does that make sense? Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. Too many people want to have the power. Anyway, the Commonwealth's men, of course, this is the moderates in Parliament who drew up the humble petition and advice. The Commonwealth's men, they're still dead against it, and they're readmitted. They immediately attack the petition. They hope to reverse it, saying it's unconstitutional. Cromwell, therefore, because they're going to vote, a Parliament you have yet to actually vote on the humble petition and advice, and when it goes to them to vote on it, Cromwell goes in there and says, fine, the Lord choose between me and you, or you and me, I believe is the actual words. He doesn't let Parliament vote on the humble petition of advice. He has accepted it before they voted on it. He knows it's unlikely to be approved by the whole of Parliament, so he dissolves Parliament. Cromwell has done what the king was unable to do. He dissolved Parliaments. Are you with me? He has done what the king was unable to do. So, Cromwell doesn't manage to get on with either of his parliaments, but he is now Lord Protector and is therefore really able to run the country without a parliament. Cromwell only nominated Richard as his son, as his successor in the last few months of his rule. And that was a real problem. Why? No, yeah, absolutely. So he'd only really just been involved. And Cromwell recognised that actually Richard was probably going to be popular with the civilian government, but he was not likely to be popular with the army. And so Cromwell realised that actually one of the things he needed to do in the last few months of his life was to get rid of most of the army opposition. The problem is Cromwell had less time left than he thought he did. He'd contracted some disease, picked up probably in Ireland when he was killing the Catholics over there. Malaria, possibly, typhoid, don't know. But anyway, Cromwell had hoped to remove the unreliable officers from the army who wouldn't support Richard, but he was too slow. He didn't have time to do that, and sadly, he died. Public debt was still massive, the army was still too expensive, and there was no appetite for the return of Charles II, so the Royalists did nothing when Cromwell died. Lord Protectorate goes to Richard. So 3rd of September 1658, Cromwell dies and Richard takes over the country. Do you get it? I think it's because Richard's government is toothless. Yeah? Yeah, anyway, that's Cromwell's death mask there on the left. That's the wax mask that was mould that was made of his face when he died. So that's what Cromwell looked like when he died, apparently.
Where is that?
Why would they do
Because he was very important.
that?
Is that like with him?
No, he's not in it, although his head is well, actually, it's long and complicated what happened to his head.
Is it like in a museum or something?
Yes. Do you know what? I don't know. British Museum, I suspect, but I don't know. Anyway, Richard, of course, was entirely toothless. That's the point of that one. The problem is that the army still really want to run the country. So that's the Protectorate. Then we're on to the Home Strait, which is, if you like, wrong button.
So from the exam to be tomorrow.
Sorry?
So from the exam to be tomorrow.
Yeah,
I feel like
keep
it's
up with
going
this.
right now.
Right. From Richard to Restoration. So the last bit of the course. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. So we've had this is still really the Protectorate under Richard. This bit is the really, really crazy bit. So it's really from September 1658 up until Charles II returns in 1660. So it's only just over a year. But there are an awful lot of people trying to run the country. That one? Let's go. That's Richard Cromwell. So, what happens? Well, Richard, of course, actually, he could have made a decent Lord Protector. He was liked. What sort of people would have liked him? Well, merchants, gentrymen, townspeople. Why would they have liked him?
Because he had nothing to do with it.
He was not a regicide. He was not a king killer. And so people who had refused so far to work with governments because they were king killers actually could work with this guy. He was a nice guy. He's not involved with the king's death. He was a nice guy. He had a pleasant manner. He was a guy, to sit down and have a good chat with. He received some good advice by a guy called General Monk. Of course, we'll come again to him in a second. But, and there's always a big but, who has he not really got the support of? Yeah. The army see him as a weak country squire, and therefore they want to extend their influence over him. And they meet at a place called Wallingford House, and they decide how are they going to do it. Disadvantages. So what was Monk's advice? General Monk sends words to Richard and says, reduce the size of the army now. If you do not, they will get rid of you. Does Richard get rid of the army? No. Why not? Why does he not do it? He knows he's got to get rid of some of his leaders, get rid of some of these things. He's got the power and the authority to do that, so why doesn't he? Sorry? He's scared. He knows he needs the army to support him, and he's just too scared to do it. So, Monk, commander of the army in Scotland, purge the army leaders, get rid of disloyal ones, save the country money when debt is spiralling at this point. People are not paying taxes. But he doesn't. He was too cowardly. He knows if he gets rid of it, he'd lose his authority. So Richard calls his first parliament. Another elected parliament is called. How does this one go on? Does he get on with it? No. Like his father's, little was achieved. It's still full of Commonwealth's men. On one hand, people like Heselrigge and Vane attacked Richard, the legality of the Protectorate, mostly because they're Commonwealth's men. And what do the Commonwealth men want? They want the Rump back. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. The Rump want to be back in power. They're constantly undermining what's going on. On the other hand, others want Parliament to have greater direct control of the army, not have a Lord Protector. So he just doesn't have a very successful first Parliament. And then the army nearly splits. Right. What happens? Heselrigge, the troublemaker, one of the Commonwealth's men, tells the junior officers that the current Parliament and the current Lord Protector would not meet their needs. What do the junior officers want? They've kind of got religious independence, where they've got toleration anyway. So the vote. They want the right to be able to vote. So what he's insinuating, what he's implying here is if you put the Rump back in charge, we will give you the right to vote. And so Lambert can see what's going on here. He said the Rump would. Lambert can see what's going on. He hoped, Heselrigge would hope the army would kick out Richard in Parliament. Actually, the senior officers were so worried about a split in the army that they do it for them. The senior officers are so worried that the junior officers would kind of take matters into their own hands. They do it. So what happens? Lambert took action and took Richard out of his office himself. There's the rump. Oh, be nice to you. What happens? 21st of April 1659, Richard calls all troops loyal to him to protect him in Parliament. Does anybody turn up at all? Yes, actually one guy, Ingoldsby, was commander. And so he surrounds Parliament as it comes up, but then the army, the Wallingford House troops and Lambert march upon Parliament. Ingoldsby and the army just disappear. They fade away. Therefore, what happens? 22nd of April 1659, Parliament is formally dismissed. 50 members of the Rump take their seats. Richard goes back to his little estates in Essex, and we never really, don't really hear of him again. Richard is gone. Who's now in charge? Oh, Rump. But what did they promise their junior officers? Did they do it?
Lambert doing now?
Sorry?
So what's Lambert?
Lambert then is still, he's just still in charge of the army.
Part of the Rump.
No, he's not part of the Rump. He's just put them in to try and keep the army together. So, return of the Rump again. But they can't deal with public debt. It's spiralling. What are people not paying?
Taxes.
Any taxes. It's just not being paid. They can't deal with it. They're massively unpopular. They can't deal with the army, and Heselrigge doesn't keep his promise to the junior officers, makes no changes. So the Rump really has not got a control of the country. They haven't got control of the army, they're not popular, people aren't paying taxes. Are they going to be around for long? No. We're back. Not for long though. And then you've got this, Booth's Rebellion, and this one's quite remarkable.
So it's royal.
It's a, yes, it's royalist.
Well, he's royal.
Who's
No,
making?
no, he's not royalist, but it's a royalist.
It's a royalist rebellion, but who's Booth?
He's a
General.
It's an army rebellion. 31st of July, 1659, George Booth, he fought for Parliament in the Civil War. He's an army officer. So suddenly you've got a parliamentarian rebellion. And what do they demand? They don't say we want the return of the king, they demand free elections. That's the one. It's a euphemism. It means, you know, they know now if you freely elect a parliament, it is likely that the parliament will of course be in favour of the return of the king. Anyway, it would result in royalist government. Now, actually, the battle was easily done. Lambert beat Booth at Wellington Bridge in August 1659. But it's the implications of this. Few people supported Booth, even though the Rump was hated. Why? People hated another civil war. Booth was Presbyterian, so didn't attract all support. The army then were hardened against the Rump. The Rump was unable to control the country. In fact, because they were so unpopular, you see, the Rump had inspired Booth to rebel. That had caused the army to fight amongst itself, which had caused the army to hate the Rump. Does that make sense? For kind of creating this mess to happen, the army is really against the Rump. The army now demand the Derby petition, and they say, we want a political settlement in this country which the army likes. Now, moving on. Oh, by the way, Booth only escaped. He escaped from the battle, but was caught when he asked for a shave in a pub. Dressed as a woman. Like that. So what happens to the Rump? The Rump now try to control the army. Because of their Derby petition, the Rump now go and try and take control of the army. Do they succeed? Not in the slightest. What do? They do what everyone's been telling people to do all along. They tried to dismiss 9 officers, including Lambert. Do those 9 officers go? Not on your Nelly. What do? So the Rump demands all loyal troops to defend them. Does anybody turn up? No, a couple, but really not much. But like Richard, these troops just disappeared when Lambert marches on them again. Nobody likes us anymore. So the Rump is gone. Now who's going to run the country? Richard's lasted a very short period of time. The Rump has lasted just a short period of time. It's the Committee of Safety. it's the army. This time they don't faff about with the Barebones Parliament. Remember, the last time the army did this, they created their own government. This time the army don't mess with it. They go, right, we are running the country, and we'll call ourselves the Committee of Safety. Committee of Safety. Are they popular? No. They're not even popular with the army. The army try and control the country with the Committee of Safety. But there's already too much chaos in the country. Debts were getting more ridiculous. Debts are now £2 million. Bear in mind, it started off at £1 million. Debts are now at £1 million in running the country. The public are refusing to support it. They're not paying their taxes. Well, any excuse, frankly, to not pay your taxes. In fact, even the army is fed up. The army is not being paid, so even the army is no longer liking the Committee of Safety. And in fact, there's an increase of threatening radical activity. So the committee was even ignored by garrisons in Portsmouth. The army was now starting to disobey the army. Are you with me? So Richard fails because he's not got support of the army. The Rump fails because it hasn't got support of the army. And the army is failing because it hasn't got support of the army. Who's next in? Not yet. General Monk, the leader of the Northern Army. What does he do? He sends a message to the Committee of Safety. Go away, restore the Rump, otherwise I will march south with the Northern Army. He starts marching. Lambert, still around, marches north to oppose him. This could be a massive showdown. New Model Army versus New Model Army, if you like. What's going to happen?
Lambert's forces like that today.
Absolutely. Every time Lambert has gone somewhere, other troops have gone elsewhere. Lambert's troops were dispirited, owing to some Monk propaganda. All disappeared. His troops dissolved. Lambert quits. Lambert's more propaganda, if you like. Lambert's troops just disappear. Monk carries on marching south. And as he gets closer to London, he comes down, he wants to restore the Rump. This is a really bizarre thing. And as he gets closer, he meets with people desperate for free elections. But he keeps coming down saying, I want the Rump back in charge. People were glad that the army politicians were gone, but hated the Rump just as much. Quite right too. The Rump continue to refuse to call new elections. So the Rump is now back in charge of the country again, but they're still refusing to call for free elections. You all still with me? Pleased to meet you. Monk and the Rump. Now, Monk turns up before Parliament, before Rump, and says, I would like you to dissolve so that we can call free elections. Does the Rump dissolve? No. And this, of course, is why we call it the Long Parliament, because it refuses to dissolve itself. The Rump hate Monk. They realise that they've been conned. They realise that he's only put them in there because that means they can dissolve themselves. So can you remember, what did they demand of Monk? To go and collect taxes. Monk is ordered by the Rump to bully the Londoners into paying taxes. To ruin his popularity, people like Monk. Does he go into London to collect taxes?
No, he doesn't get the old Rump.
Well done. Okay, he goes. Free elections, wink. So what happens? Monk does go to London. He goes into London, but instead of collecting taxes, meets with the ex-Rump MPs, these 300-odd MPs who outnumber the Rump easily. All these people who go back to Pride's Purge back in 1648 rather. You've got to go back to there. These are the people who've been out of government now for the last 11 years, are invited to come back again on one condition. Free elections. Dissolve the Rump, please. So he agrees to escort them back to Parliament, armed escort, in return for agreeing to dissolve it. 100 MPs return, easily outnumber the 50 Rumpers. The Rump Parliament finally is dissolved. They are finally dissolved. 16th of March. So what happens? Oh, that's the Rump. So interestingly, at no point did Monk show himself to be a royalist. What he has done is managed to do a royalist coup. He's now by doing this, and at no point had he ever marked himself out as a royalist. Why? Because the likelihood is it would have been too dangerous for him. The army would not have listened to him. If he did, the Commonwealth Rebellion, the royalists thought he was against him all the time up until this point. There we go, down with the king. So how does it finish? So there are, for the first time, free elections, properly free elections, and it's called the Convention Parliament. Why is it called the Convention Parliament? Do you know? Because it wasn't called by the king. So it was a parliament that was called by the country without actually being demanded by the king. And they met, and they just had one thing to discuss. They discussed what terms would they offer Charles II, not if they wanted him as king. There was no discussion, should we have Charles II, it was what terms should we offer him. And they did offer him a few terms. There was some debate about Presbyterianism, should they bring it in, but they said no, we'll just keep the Church of England as it is, thank you very much. And so they published something called the Declaration of Breda. Charles II agrees that he had no intention of acting like a dictator. He would not kill off all the people who had signed, who had fought against his father, although he broke that one. He would pay Monk's troops. And so on the 8th of May 1660, Charles II is proclaimed King of England. I like this. And John Evelyn, a diarist at the time, said, and all this was done without a drop of blood being shed, and by that very army that had revelled against him. The end. The end. Right. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. What were they? Could you rattle off the top of your head? I don't know. 2, 3 weaknesses, 2, 3 strengths? Any ideas?
Well, yeah. Different kind of head. Well, that's a full.
Any ideas? Strengths and weaknesses. Can we get a strength for a start? Commonwealth and Protectorate. Are there any strengths? Some reforms. There's a lot of reforms. The Rump bringing in reforms. Barebones bringing in reforms. Cromwell brings in reforms. Some sensible reforms. Yes. Then the sense that they've got a sense of the long-term future of the country. Yes. Other strengths.
At some point, Cromwell did manage to have the support of the army and people.
Yeah, you know, the Protectorate could have worked. He did have support. Yeah.
They got back the monarchy.
That somehow managed to bring back a monarchy without another civil war, yes. I would say the fact that you had a strong army throughout. You know, that is a strength. The army was strong and they were not able to kind of weren't really overthrown.
That was also a weakness.
It is also a weakness. Go on then, what's the weaknesses?
They hardly ever had the army support.
Yeah, the army wanted its own power. The army was not really willing to support, it was only willing to support whoever was in charge as long as it kind of kept them in power as well. So the army wants power. Other weaknesses?
There's so many ideas and groups that want to run the country just in such a short period.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a wealth of different ideas kind of around it. And of course, lots of different people who want control. Army want control. The Commonwealth's men want control. All these people willing to undermine whatever government to make sure that they stay in some sort of sense of control. And yet, another big weakness: spiralling debts, getting up to £2 million. Anything else, weakness-wise? Well, I think we've hit quite a few of the key ones here. The fact is that unless you had Cromwell, unless you had somebody who was at the public backing, they just could not run the country. So the Rump, the Barebones, the Committee of Safety, Richard, they just didn't have enough broad backing to be able to do that. And therefore it was always fundamentally going to fail. Another weakness, of course, is that every single parliament of the whole Commonwealth failed. Was there a single parliament which actually succeeded? No. Cromwell dissolves the first couple and then then one dissolves the two that are within his own parliament. So, key question 4, assess strengths and weakness, Commonwealth, Protectorate.